Hello and welcome, I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories this hour. President Trump calls Saudi Arabia America's strongest partner and unveils a $142 billion arms deal in Riyadh. He also promises to end all sanctions on Syria, urging a new path towards greatness for the war-torn nation. A major trade deal between Washington and Beijing takes effect, cutting most tariffs and halting a damaging trade war. The agreement, reached in Geneva talks, offers temporary relief to global markets and supply chains. Ukrainian President Zelensky says he'll only attend Ukraine-Russia talks if Putin shows up in person. He challenges the Kremlin, saying Putin is too scared for a face-to-face meeting in Istanbul. US President Donald Trump met Syria's interim president Ahmed al-Shara in Riyadh today, a White House official has confirmed. The surprise meeting comes a day after Trump announced he would lift sanctions on Damascus ahead of a broader Gulf leaders summit. At least 48 people, including 22 children, die in overnight strikes on northern Gaza, hours after Hamas freed a hostage in a US brokered deal, according to reports. Netanyahu vows to destroy Hamas, saying Israel's escalation is days away, despite global calls for a ceasefire. Canada's new Prime Minister Mark Carney unveils a 29-member cabinet to reset ties with President Trump. Key ministers stay on as Ottawa prepares to redefine its US trade strategy. Fierce street battles shake Libya's capital for a second night after the killing of a militia leader sparks rival faction fighting. The UN says it's deeply alarmed by the violence in crowded neighborhoods and is urgently calling for a ceasefire. China and Colombia sign a landmark deal bringing Bogota into Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative. President Xi calls for a quality upgrade in ties after meeting Colombian leader Gustavo Petro in Beijing. Our top story today, India's External Affairs Ministry has rejected China's attempt to rename 30 locations in Arunachal Pradesh last month, saying such practices will not alter the reality. Last month, China released the fourth list announcing Chinese and Tibetan names for 30 locations in the Indian state. The names will be reflected on official Chinese maps later this year. The Indian MEA has criticised China for continuing what it called vain and preposterous attempts to rename locations in Arunachal Pradesh. It said such actions are categorically rejected and do not change India's consistent position. The ministry asserted that creative naming exercises will not alter the undeniable reality that Arunachal Pradesh was, is, and will always remain an integral and inalienable part of India. This latest attempt is the fourth time Beijing has asserted its claim over the state. Despite New Delhi's multiple rejections, China claims the southern part of Arunachal Pradesh as its own, calling it the Tibet Autonomous Region, named Zagnan. China has repeatedly renamed locations in Arunachal Pradesh. A 2024 government notice quoted by Global Times banned unauthorized use or translation of foreign place names that undermine China's territorial claims. This latest action follows a similar incident in 2017 when China renamed several locations after the Dalai Lama visited Arunachal Pradesh. China condemned his visit, labeling him a separatist and accusing him of attempting to establish an independent Tibetan state. We are joined by Madhav Nalapat, editor of the Sunday Guardian, located in New Delhi, to discuss this in more detail. Professor Nalapat, thank you for joining us. What do you make of China's repeated attempts to rename Indian territory?
Well, I'd like to point out that it's absolutely no surprise. I'm surprised that if anyone would be surprised at this, the Chinese, frankly, are implacably opposed to the rise of India. And they have the most honeyed language in their diplomatic exchanges with India. And then in practice, they do this. So there's one thing in words, another in practice. And we have to look only at the practice, not the words. One thing I can tell you, China is implacably opposed to India growing because it sees India as a threat. They like it or not, whether President Trump has a trade deal today or not, the mechanics of the Cold War 2.0 between the US and China will be playing out, and Trump will have to reverse his decision on China, if not in the next 90 days, then definitely in the next 6 months or so. That is an irreconcilable difference between security interests of the United States and security interests of China. In much the same way, I would say India has irreconcilable security differences with China. Now remember, the US and India are generating the largest and the second largest trade surplus for China. These are both, huge trade surpluses of which China is the beneficiary. I think it's important to look at this and to understand that China will be always implacably opposed to the rise of India, implacably opposed to progress being made by India, because China knows the reality of Cold War 2.0. It knows there's a possibility of massive relocation from China, and it does not want India to be the beneficiary of that for simple reason. The other countries, ASEAN countries, are much smaller and really not much of a threat. But if India grows in size, then of course India becomes a threat basically to any industry remaining in China. In my personal view, decoupling is inevitable, and the Chinese, of course, are looking for alternatives. They're trying to produce in Thailand, Mexico, and all that, but it's only a matter of time before these subterfuges are discovered, and it is discovered that basically these are assembly plants for Chinese components, and in large numbers of them, Chinese labor. So I'd like to say this is another signal that China is implacably opposed to India, and I think it's important that we heed the symbols and not listen to those who say, oh, no, there's a prospect of peace between India and China. Ted.
Yes, and Professor Nalapat, how do you think India should respond to this, if it should even use its time doing that?
Look, there's no question that the Ministry of External Affairs has responded correctly, and there's no question about that. It has rubbished this effort by China, but that does not disguise the fact that Chinese maps that the territory is wrongly given, and does not disguise the fact that several times in the past they have, for example, Aksai Chin. On their maps, they showed Aksai Chin as part of China. At that point in time, the then government of India had no idea that they were moving into Aksai Chin. They only later, after it became a fait accompli, that they found out. So the reality situation is we can't wait for fait accomplis or fates accompli. We have to move now. And in my view, one answer would be a strong security alliance between India, Japan, Australia, and the US. Mutual security pact. The other three countries are already linked by security pact. India is the only outlier. I think it's time to give up this policy of non-alignment and understand this is a world that is getting aligned with either of the two superpowers. And if we want to be a third superpower, we'll also have to be aligned. So in my view, there's no question that we should align ourselves with the Quad, with the West, with Europe, with the United States, with Japan, and countries that are opposed, frankly, to expansionism by China, rampant expansionism. We cannot ignore this. In the government in the 1950s ignored it on Aksai Chin to its own cost. We cannot ignore this signal. And we are not ignoring this signal. Under Prime Minister Modi, extensive work
Yes.
has gone between to creating defense infrastructure in the border with China, and I think that work will continue, and India will be in full readiness at any point in time. Ted.
Okay, Professor Madhav Nalaput, thank you very much for your insight on the issue. We now move over to the Middle East, where a major meeting between US President Donald Trump and Gulf Cooperation Council leaders is underway in Riyadh. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman opened the summit, calling for an end to the war in Gaza and a lasting solution for the Palestinian people. He also stressed the need for diplomatic solutions in Yemen and in Sudan, while praising strong Gulf US ties. Trump took the next stage, praising the Gulf states for their unity, friendship, and rapid progress in the region. He vowed to confront aggression that threatens us all, criticizing the Biden administration for empowering Iran and promising to deal only if Tehran halts terror and support and nuclear ambitions. On Gaza, Trump thanked GCC nations for their role in seeking peace and called for the release of all the Israeli hostages. He also mentioned potential US steps towards normalizing ties with Syria and supporting peace in Lebanon. The summit wrapped up with a message of thanks from the Crown Prince, who hopes to see stronger cooperation going forward. In a related development, US President Donald Trump met Syrian President Ahmed al-Shara in Saudi Arabia, announcing the lifting of all US sanctions on Syria and exploring normalization of ties. The meeting, held during a Gulf summit, included virtual participation by Turkey's President Erdogan. Trump urged Shara to normalize ties with Israel, despite Israeli opposition and concerns over Shara's past ties to al-Qaeda. The move drew praise from Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Trump cited support from Saudi Arabia and Turkey, saying the move offers Syria a chance at greatness. The decision aimed at boosting humanitarian aid, trade and investment. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio will meet his Syrian counterpart this week. Syrian and Lebanese leaders welcome the move as a turning point. Members of both US parties cautiously supported the decision. The UN also praised the move, seeing it as a step towards Syria's recovery. Sanctions had previously isolated Syria financially and politically, placing it among the most heavily restricted nations globally. Listen to what the US president has said on the issue.
The support of leaders in this room, and they're great leaders, you are. We are currently exploring normalizing relations with Syria's new government, as you know, beginning with my meeting with President Ahmed al-Shara and Secretary Rubio's meeting with the Syrian foreign minister in Turkey. After discussing the situation with Crown Prince Mohammed and President Erdogan of Turkey, I am also ordering the cessation of sanctions against Syria to give them a fresh start. It gives them a chance for greatness. The sanctions were really crippling.
Moving on, a major shift in global trade. A new deal between the United States and China has now come into effect, marking a rare moment of calm in a trade war that's rattled markets and supply chains around the world. The agreement, finalized earlier this week in Geneva, slashes most of the heavy tariffs that have defined years of tensions between the world's two largest economies. President Trump is calling it a very, very strong deal. Speaking to Fox News while en route to the Gulf, he said the most exciting part is China opening up its economy to American businesses. Let's listen in to what the US president said.
One of the things I think that could be most exciting for us and also for China is that we're trying to open up China because, as you know, many years ago we opened up the USA. Now it's time for China to open up, and that's part of our deal.
While details remain scarce, the White House says this deal lays out a clear framework and could be a game changer for US companies seeking access to China's massive market. For now, it's a temporary ceasefire, but one that could have lasting impacts on global trade. Moving on once again, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan has claimed responsibility for a series of attacks on Pakistani military convoys and posts under Operation Al-Kandak between May the 8th and May the 13th, targeting Indian forces in Khyber, Waziristan and Makran. The deadliest attack took place on May the 13th in Khyber, where the TTP claims to have ambushed a Royal Indian Army convoy, killing 7 soldiers and injuring 2 others. Other incidents included sniper, grenade launcher attacks, missile strike and ambushes, causing additional casualties. TTP says these attacks are retaliation for Indian shelling on civilian areas. No official response from India has been made, and independent verification is unavailable due to the remoteness of the areas involved. Security experts fear this could escalate India-Pakistan tensions. Moving over to Europe now, where French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot has said that European Union has approved a 17th sanctions package on Russia. Barrot has stated that the bloc will now turn to working on further, tougher sanctions with the US. The package was agreed during a meeting of ambassadors this morning and is expected to be formally approved by foreign affairs ministers next week. It is expected to target Russia's shadow fleet, consisting of old-age ships deployed around the world, transporting embargoed Russian oil products. 153 tankers from the shadow fleet have been targeted by the EU, but the latest package is expected to bring the total number of sanctioned vessels to more than 350. This comes after Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky urged US counterpart Donald Trump to help secure a meeting with Vladimir Putin in Turkey on Thursday, while accusing the Russian leader of not seriously wanting to end the war. The Kremlin has refused to say whether Putin will travel to Turkey or not after himself proposed Russia-Ukraine talks in a weekend Kremlin address. Russia has yet to reveal the makeup of the Russian delegation to Istanbul. However, reports suggest that an all for a prisoner exchange could be discussed in the meeting. On the other hand, as US President Donald Trump kicks off his Middle East trip, he said in Riyadh that US Secretary of State Marco Rubio will be in the US delegation at the peace talks in Istanbul, which could yield, quote, pretty good results. Moving back over to the Middle East, where Israeli airstrikes have intensified across Gaza, with at least 48 Palestinians killed since midnight, according to local medics. The Indonesian hospital in Jabalia confirms at least 22 children are among the victims. Israeli forces struck 5 residential buildings in Jabalia city and its refugee camp. Civil defense crews called the scene catastrophic. Many bodies remain buried under the rubble. Residents say no warning was given before the strikes. And on Tuesday, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says there was no way Israel would halt its war in Gaza, effectively dismissing any near-term ceasefire. The Israeli military has not commented on the strikes, but said it had warned residents to evacuate Jabalia due to Hamas rocket launchers in the area. The escalation comes a day after Hamas released an Israeli-American hostage in a deal brokered by the United States. The release coincided with President Donald Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia. Meanwhile, a US-Israeli plan to distribute aid in Gaza has been rejected by Russia, China, and the United Kingdom. They're instead calling for Israel to lift its 2-month blockade to allow unrestricted humanitarian access into the Gaza Strip. We're now joined by Ali M Bushbach, independent Palestinian researcher located in Cairo, to discuss this in further detail. Thank you very much, Ali, for joining us. We've had reports today of 48 people killed, 22 of those children in the Gaza Strip. This is an ongoing situation. Given the scale of civilian casualties reported, how do you think Israel is undertaking this conflict? It seems like a repeated conversation, but it has to be questioned.
Well, thank you for having me. On the ground, the situation is completely dire in Gaza, especially the most of the casualties from Gaza and from the Israelis bombardment is a civilian, while Israel predicted that Israel forces targeting the commander of Hamas and retaliated from Gaza. I mean, from the area that the Palestinian military group launched. A rocket into the Israel. So things is always that children and women and old people, they are the casualties from the Israelis bombardment. Yesterday, Israel targeted Europe hospital in Khan Yunis, and also yesterday night at the midnight, Israel targeted Jabalia area, either a refugee camp or Jabalia city in northern Gaza. So making the situation more miserable for the people who has a no shelter for them, and they are displaced several of time due to the Israelis attack. On the ground, people are really suffering from the Israeli bombardment on one side. On other side, people are suffering from the starvation and the famine in Gaza due to the Israeli restriction in the entering the humanitarian aid into Gaza. So the things is we are in front of uh, 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 a negative atmosphere about the end of war between Israel and Gaza. Yesterday, Israeli delegation went to Doha and the capital of Qatar to negotiate and to talk about the ceasefire, while on the while also Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, insist that the war will not end until achieved all the aims of Israel of this war. So the significant aims for this war is devastated Hamas, which it sounds not logical, and it not sounds as things could be achieved, because devastating a military group using the guerrilla technique to attack Israeli, it's something, and an urban war, it's not that easy to defeat, and I mean, this kind of a group. So the things is, it's more complicated, despite Donald Trump giving a glimmer of hope for Palestinians yesterday during his speech, that they are going to the peace, and he hoped the peace for Palestinians. That's mean he withdrew from his plan that Gaza, the Gazians from their land. Things is more complicated nowadays, especially the Israelis military body. They are insist for the expanded offensive operation in Gaza after the visit of Donald Trump in the Middle East, as well as Hamas seems that, especially after the deal between America
Ali,
and
I'm sorry for interrupting, but I just wanted to bring something else up. Obviously, we've seen limited number of heads of state directly criticizing the Israeli government, okay, in this war. But recently, with the extended Israeli operation announced, and also this blockade that's been going on for almost 2 months now, it feels like momentum is building up. Do you think the tide is turning diplomatically? What do you make of the rejection of the US-Israel aid plan by China and Russia and the UK? I mean, these are countries that are not aligned politically yet. They're still condemning this US-Israel-led aid plan into Gaza. They want unrestricted humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip.
But let me just mention that about expanded the offensive in Gaza. During the Israelis invaded Rafah, all the international community warning Israel to not invade Rafah, because it will make a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Despite that, Israel insists to invade Rafah and attack Rafah. That what happened ultimately. Israel completely controlled this area in southern part of Gaza, despite it's considered as a safe area by Israeli military, and asking the people from northern Gaza to displace to that area. About the expanded offensive, I guess if Israel going to do it, it will do it despite the condemnation of the international community, as well as it's not about the American and Israel plan for humanitarian aid. It's completely rejected by the all international community, even not also about Russia, China, and the United Kingdom. Also, it's rejected by France, that Emmanuel Macron asked, as well as Germany asked Israel to adhere to its humanitarian protocols and the humanitarian possibility. Also, that United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, he said that this kind of plan, it's humiliating the Palestinian, and it could be used for displacement and forced displacement for the Palestinian from Gaza, as well as the Palestinian
Ali,
community.
I'm really sorry, we're running out of time here. Thank you very much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have your insight on the program. But we move on and stay in the region. Israel has issued evacuation warnings for 3 major seaports in Yemen, Ras Issa, Hodeida and Salif, after intercepting a missile fired from Yemen towards its territory. The missile, launched by the Iran-aligned Houthi group, was aimed at the Ben Gurion airport near Tel Aviv. Earlier this month, Trump announced a ceasefire deal with the Houthis, mediated by Oman, to halt strike attacks on US vessels. This agreement did not cover attacks against Israel. The Houthis say their missile strikes and Red Sea attacks are in support of Palestinians in Gaza, where Israel continues its military assault against Hamas following the deadly October the 7th attacks. Israel, in turn, has carried out retaliatory strikes on Houthi positions in Yemen. Listen to what the Houthi military spokesman has to say.
نفذت القوة الصاروخية في القوات المسلحة اليمنية عملية عسكرية نوعية استهدفت مطار اللد المسمى إسرائيليا مطار بن غوريون في منطقة يافا المحتلة، وذلك بصاروخ باليستي فرط صوتي، وقد حقق الصاروخ هدفه بنجاح بفضل الله، وأجبر ملايين الصهاينة المحتلين على الهروب إلى الملاجئ ووقف حركة الملاحة في المطار قرابة الساعة، ويعد هذا هو الصاروخ الثالث خلال أقل من 24 ساعة.
Sirens also sounded across several parts of Jerusalem as the Israeli army intercepted the missile fired from Yemen. Meanwhile, Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Saar has condemned the latest missile strikes from Yemen as war crimes after a second missile was intercepted in less than 24 hours. Let's listen to what he had to say. We now move on. Apologies, some technical issues there. Hollywood veteran Robert De Niro has called US President Donald Trump a Philistine and lambasted his proposed tariff at the Cannes Film Festival opening ceremony on Tuesday. De Niro used his Lifetime Achievement Award speech to call for protests against Trump's funding cuts on the arts, humanities, and on education. He also condemned Trump's 100% tariffs on films produced outside of the United States. The seasoned actor mocked Trump by saying that one can't put a price on creativity, but apparently they can put a tariff on it, and then called on the audience to protest against Trump. Here's what he said at the ceremony.
America's Philistine president has had himself appointed head of one of our premier cultural institutions. He has cut funding and support to the arts, humanities, and education. And now he has announced a 100% tariff on films produced outside the U.S. Let that sink in for a minute. You can't put a price on creativity, but apparently you can put a tariff on it. Of course, this is unacceptable. All these attacks are unacceptable. And this isn't just an American problem, it's a global one. Unlike a film, we can't just all sit back and watch. We have to act, and we have to act now. Without violence, but with great passion and determination. It's time for everyone who cares about liberty to organize, to protest, and when there are elections, of course, to vote. Vote. Tonight and for the next 11 days, we show our strength and commitment by celebrating art in this glorious festival. Liberté, égalité, fraternité.
Meanwhile, Juliette Binoche, the head of this year's jury, used her speech to pay tribute to the Palestinian photojournalist Fatma Husana, the subject of a documentary to be shown at Cannes, who was killed in an Israeli airstrike in Gaza. Well, that's all we have time for. We will continue to bring you more news updates from around the world.